It's June 13th, 1948, in Tokyo, Japan. The summer heat is building. A 38-year-old writer named Osamu Dazai walks to the Tamagawa Canal with a woman named Tomi Yamazaki. They're lovers. They've planned this for weeks. They fill their pockets with stones and jump into the water together. 6 days later, their bodies are found downstream. Dazai's birthday, June 19th. He would have been 39 years old. This is Dazai's 5th suicide attempt. The first 4 failed. He tried hanging, tried drowning with different women, tried overdoses. Each time, he survived. But this time, he made sure. And 1 month before he died, he finished his final novel, a semi-autobiographical work about a man who cannot connect with other humans, who wears masks his entire life pretending to be normal, who destroys himself slowly through alcohol, drugs, and self-hatred until there's nothing left. The book is called nolongerhuman, and it's one of the most psychologically devastating pieces of literature ever written. In Japan, it's the 2nd best-selling novel of all time, only behind Natsume Soseki's Kokoro. Millions of copies sold, required reading in schools, a cultural touchstone for understanding depression, shame, and the inability to be authentically human. But in the West, most people have never heard of it, never read it, never encountered Yozo Oba, the protagonist who might be the most honest depiction of clinical depression in all of literature. And if you've been following this channel, you'll recognize something immediately. This is the Japanese version of Notes from Underground. This is Dostoevsky's Underground Man reborn in post-war Japan. Same consciousness turned against itself. Same inability to act authentically. Same psychological torture of being too aware. But where Dostoevsky's Underground Man chose his isolation, Dazai's Yozo never had a choice. He was born incapable of understanding humans, born without the ability to connect, born fundamentally broken in ways he couldn't fix no matter how hard he tried. Dostoevsky wrote about consciousness as disease. Dazai lived it, then wrote about it, then ended his life because living with that consciousness became unbearable. This book is a suicide note disguised as fiction. It's a confession, an explanation, a final attempt to make someone understand what it's like to be incapable of being human, to wear masks every single day, to perform normalcy while dying inside. And the terrifying part? Millions of readers recognize themselves in Yozo, see their own masks, their own performances, their own quiet desperation to appear normal while feeling fundamentally broken. This isn't just a Japanese story. This is the modern condition, the epidemic of depression and anxiety, the feeling that everyone else got the manual for being human and you're just faking it, the exhaustion of pretending to be okay when you're falling apart. Dazai wrote this in 1948, 77 years ago, and it's more relevant now than ever. So today, we're diving into nolongerhuman. We're going to understand why Dazai couldn't live with himself, why this book haunts everyone who reads it, and why it might be the most honest book ever written about what it means to fail at being human. Let's begin. To understand nolongerhuman, you need to understand Osamu Dazai, because this book isn't fiction. It's autobiography barely disguised. Everything Yozo does, Dazai did. Every thought Yozo has, Dazai had. Every suicide attempt, every addiction, every relationship destroyed, all of it happened. Born June 19, 1909 in Kannagi, a small town in northern Japan. Wealthy family. His father was a landowner and politician. Dazai grew up in privilege, big house, servants, everything a child could want materially, but emotionally, nothing. His mother was distant, sickly. Dazai was raised by servants and wet nurses. He barely saw his parents, felt like an outsider in his own family, like he was tolerated but not wanted, not truly part of the household. And from childhood, he wore masks, performed happiness, played the clown to make people laugh because he learned early that if he entertained them, they would tolerate him. If he made them smile, They wouldn't see how empty he was inside. This is the core trauma of the book, not abuse, not violence, just the quiet realization that you don't understand other humans, that everyone else seems to operate on instincts you don't have. That being human comes naturally to everyone except you. By the time Dazai was in school, he was already performing constantly, class clown, always joking, always putting on shows. But inside, terror, constant terror that someone would see through the act, would realize he was faking everything, would discover he wasn't actually human at all. He went to Tokyo Imperial University, studied French literature, but he wasn't there to learn. He was there to destroy himself. First suicide attempt, 1929, age 20. He tried to hang himself but failed. The rope broke or he was found. Accounts vary. Either way, he survived. Second attempt, same year. He convinced a woman, a bar hostess named Tanabe, to commit double suicide with him. They jumped into the ocean together. She died. He survived. Her body washed up on shore. His didn't. He walked away. And here's what's important. He was charged with abetting suicide, criminal case. His wealthy family bribed officials to make it go away. But Dazai carried that guilt forever. The knowledge that he killed someone, that she died and he lived, that he used her death as a tool for his own escape, and failed even at that. Third attempt, 1930. Sleeping pills. Survived again. By his mid-20s, Dazai was a published writer, getting recognition, building a literary career, and simultaneously destroying himself with alcohol, drugs, and affairs. He married twice, had multiple mistresses, betrayed everyone who loved him, not because he was cruel, but because he couldn't feel real connection, couldn't be authentic, could only perform and hate himself for performing. Fourth attempt, 1937, hanging again, found before death, survived. His writing during this period was brilliant, dark, psychological, stories about failure, shame, and the inability to be human. Critics loved it. Readers connected with it. But Dazai couldn't accept success, couldn't believe he deserved anything good. Every achievement felt like fraud, like he was tricking people into thinking he had value. Then came World War II, Japan's militarization, nationalism, propaganda. Everyone expected to sacrifice for the emperor, to be proud Japanese citizens, to embrace duty and honor. Dazai couldn't do it, couldn't feel patriotic, couldn't believe in the war. He saw through the propaganda, but had to pretend to support it, had to wear another mask, had to perform nationalism while feeling nothing but emptiness. The war destroyed Japan. Atomic bombs, cities burned, millions dead, total defeat. Everything Japanese people believed about their superiority, their destiny, their divine emperor, shattered in August 1945. And for Dazai, it confirmed everything he already believed. That meaning is constructed, that identity is performance, that everything people believe about themselves is illusion. The entire nation had been wearing masks, performing roles. And when those roles collapsed, everyone faced the same void Dazai had been living in his whole life. Post-war Japan was chaos, food shortages, American occupation, cultural crisis. What does it mean to be Japanese when everything that defined Japanese identity has been destroyed? This is when Dazai wrote nolongerhuman. 1948. 3 years after the war ended. Japan was still in ruins, still trying to rebuild not just physically, but psychologically, still asking, who are we now? And Dazai wrote about a man who never knew who he was, who performed humanity without ever feeling human, who destroyed himself slowly because existing as a fake was more painful than not existing at all. He wrote it in first person, 3 notebooks. Yozo Oba, telling his story from childhood to complete degradation. And everyone who knew Dazai recognized it as confession. This was his life, his psychology, his explanation for why he couldn't live anymore. He finished the book in May 1948. 1 month later, he was dead. Fifth attempt, successful. Here's what you need to understand. Dazai didn't write this book and then decide to die. He was planning to die the entire time he was writing it. The book is his suicide note, his final explanation, his way of saying, "This is why I can't do this anymore. This is what it's like to be incapable of being human. This is the consciousness that became unbearable." And the terrifying part? He wasn't mentally ill in the obvious way. He wasn't psychotic, wasn't delusional. He understood reality perfectly, too perfectly. He saw through all the social constructs, all the performances, all the masks everyone wears, and that clarity killed him. This connects directly to Dostoevsky, to the underground man's disease of consciousness, to the idea that too much awareness makes life impossible, that seeing through everything means you can't authentically participate in anything. But where Dostoevsky's underground man was theoretical, a philosophical character exploring ideas, Dazai's Yozo is real. This actually happened. A real human being lived this consciousness, and it destroyed him. Dostoevsky wrote about consciousness as disease and survived, wrote other books, found meaning in faith and suffering, lived to 60. Dazai wrote about consciousness as disease and didn't survive, couldn't find meaning, couldn't bear existence, died at 38. Same insight, different outcomes, one theoretical, one lived to death. And that's why Nolongerhuman hits different than Notes from Underground, because you're not reading philosophy. You're reading someone's actual psychological collapse documented in real time. You're watching someone explain why they can't live anymore, and then they prove it. So when you read this book, and you should read this book, remember, this isn't fiction. This is a man trying to make you understand what it's like to be incapable of being human, to wear masks every day, to perform normalcy while dying inside. And 1 month after he finished explaining it, he filled his pockets with stones and jumped into a canal, because sometimes understanding why you can't live doesn't give you a reason to live. Sometimes clarity just makes it worse. Now let's see what he wrote. Let's meet Yozo Oba. Let's understand what consciousness looked like for someone who couldn't bear it. Nolongerhuman is structured as 3 notebooks, 3 confessions, 3 stages of Yozo Oba's psychological disintegration from childhood to complete destruction. But before we get to the notebooks, the book opens with a prologue. A nameless narrator discovers photographs of a man named Yozo. 3 photographs: childhood, young adulthood, and late adulthood. And the narrator is disturbed by these photographs because he can't read the expression on Yozo's face. Is he smiling? Is he in pain? Is this a human face at all? The narrator says, "I have seen 3 pictures of the man. The first showed him as a child, perhaps 10 years old, but for all I knew, it might have been a girl." Already from the first page, we're told this person is fundamentally ambiguous, unreadable, neither clearly male nor female, happy nor sad, human nor something else. This is the setup. And then we get Yozo's notebooks, his explanation, his confession of why he appears this way. The first notebook. Childhood Yozo begins with a confession that will define the entire book. "Mine has been a life of much shame. I can't even guess what it must be to live the life of a human being. Not I am ashamed, but I have been a life of much shame." Shame isn't something he feels occasionally, it's what he is, his fundamental state of existence. And more importantly, I can't even guess what it must be to live the life of a human being. He doesn't understand humans, cannot comprehend what it's like to be one. He's been among them his whole life but has no idea how they work, what they feel, what makes them do what they do. He describes watching people and being confused constantly. Why do they get angry about small things? Why do they laugh at jokes he doesn't understand? Why do they care about things that seem meaningless? Why do they operate on instincts that make no sense to him? But he learns early. If you ask these questions out loud, people look at you like you're broken. So instead, he develops a strategy. He becomes a clown. He performs, makes funny faces, does silly things, makes people laugh. And if he's entertaining enough, they won't notice he doesn't understand them, won't see that he's fundamentally different, won't realize he's not actually human. Listen to how he describes this. My apprehension on discovering that my concept of happiness seemed to be completely at variance with that of everyone else was so great as to make me toss sleeplessly and groan night after night in my bed. It drove me indeed to the brink of lunacy. He's not sad about being different. He's terrified, existentially terrified that he's fundamentally broken, that everyone else was born with an instruction manual for being human and he was born without one. So he watches, studies, learns to mimic, creates a performance of normalcy so convincing that nobody suspects. But inside, he's constantly analyzing every interaction, constantly checking, did I do that right? Did I respond correctly? Did I fool them? This is exhausting. Imagine living every single moment of your life on stage, never able to relax, never able to just be, always performing, always watching yourself perform, always terrified someone will see through the act. This is consciousness as torture. This is what Dostoevsky meant by disease of consciousness. The underground man was paralyzed by self-awareness. Yozo is performing constantly because of self-awareness. Same problem, different manifestation. And there's a scene in childhood that crystallizes this. Yozo's family is having a discussion about what to buy him. Everyone suggests things. Yozo doesn't care, doesn't want anything. But he knows he has to want something because that's what normal children do. So he picks randomly a lion mask, not because he wants it, but because someone suggested it and he knows he has to choose something. And everyone praises him for his choice, tells him how good he is, how easy to please. But inside, Yozo feels horror. Because they don't know. They don't realize he's faking. They think he's a normal, happy child when really he's a performer, wearing a mask, choosing another mask to wear. This is the core trauma. Not abuse, not neglect. Just the quiet realization that you're fundamentally different and you have to hide it forever. The second notebook, Youth and Destruction. Yozo goes to school in Tokyo, high school, then university. And this is where the performance becomes unsustainable. Because in childhood, the performance is simple. Make people laugh, be cute, be harmless. But as an adult, the performance becomes more complex. You have to have opinions, ambitions, desires. You have to want things and work toward them. You have to form real relationships based on mutual understanding. And Yozo can't do any of it. Can't feel real ambition, can't form real connections, can't stop analyzing every interaction until it becomes meaningless. So he finds different masks, different performances. He joins communist study groups. Not because he believes in communism, but because it gives him a role to play, gives him lines to recite, gives him an identity that looks like conviction, but requires no real internal belief. He drinks, heavily, because alcohol briefly turns off the constant self-monitoring, makes the performance automatic, lets him stop thinking about whether he's doing human correctly. He pursues women, not because he desires them specifically, but because that's what young men do. That's the performance expected. So he has affairs, multiple affairs. And women fall for him because he's so attentive, so focused on them. But he's only focused because he's studying them, trying to figure out what response they want so he can provide it. He meets a woman named Tsuneko. She's a bar hostess, older than him, experienced, and she's also broken, also performing, also wearing masks. They recognize something in each other, the same fundamentals, emptiness. So they decide to commit double suicide, not because life is unbearable in a specific way, but because existence itself is unbearable. Because performing humanity forever is more exhausting than not existing. They go to the ocean, Kamakura, fill their pockets with stones, jump in together. She dies. He survives. This is based on Dazai's real second suicide attempt, the bar hostess Tanabe, who died while he lived. And Yozo carries this exactly like Dazai carried it. Not just guilt, but proof that even failure he fails at, even suicide he can't do right, even choosing death, he's denied that escape. He's arrested, questioned, released because his family is wealthy and influential. But everyone knows what he did. Everyone sees him differently now. The mask has cracked. The performance has failed. And this is when he truly falls apart. He gets addicted. First alcohol, then morphine, then anything that makes consciousness bearable. Because without substances, the self-awareness is too much. The constant analysis, the inability to just exist without thinking about existing. He goes to art school, tries to be a painter, but he can't even paint authentically. Everything he creates feels fake, performative, like he's painting what he thinks art should look like rather than expressing anything real. He has more affairs, more women who see him as sensitive, artistic, damaged in a romantic way. But he knows the truth. He's not sensitive. He's incapable of feeling in the way they think he feels. He's just skilled at performing sensitivity. One woman, Yoshiko, is pure, innocent, trusts everyone completely, has no masks at all. And Yozo is fascinated by this because he can't imagine being that unguarded, can't comprehend existing without constant performance. They get married. And Yozo tries to be a husband, tries to perform domesticity, but he's still drinking, still using morphine, still having affairs because he can't be faithful to something he doesn't actually feel. Then Yoshiko is assaulted by a man they knew, someone who took advantage of her innocence, her trust. And Yozo's response? He feels nothing, should feel rage, should want revenge, should protect her. But he just feels empty, analytical, watching himself fail to feel the correct emotions. This destroys the marriage, not because Yoshiko blames him, but because Yozo blames himself for being incapable of the appropriate human response, for failing even at being a wronged husband. The third notebook, Complete Disqualification. The final notebook is short, brutal. Yozo has been committed to a mental institution by his family. They're ashamed of him, want him hidden away, out of sight. He's diagnosed, treated like he's mentally ill. But he's not ill in the way they think. He's not hallucinating, not delusional. He understands reality perfectly, too perfectly. That's the problem. The doctors can't help him because his problem isn't chemical, it's existential. He's conscious of consciousness itself, aware of awareness, and that recursive loop has made existence unbearable. He's released eventually, goes to live in the countryside, away from Tokyo, away from having to perform normalcy. He drinks constantly, uses morphine constantly, barely exists. And the novel ends with this: now I have neither happiness nor unhappiness. Everything passes. That is the one and only thing that I have thought resembled a truth in the society of human beings where I have dwelled up to now as in a burning hell. Everything passes. Not suicide, not death. Just nothing. Complete dissolution of self. No longer even capable of suffering, because suffering requires caring about something. And Yozo has moved beyond caring. The title nolongerhuman. In Japanese it's ningen shikaku, which more literally means disqualified as a human being. Yozo hasn't just failed at being human, he's been disqualified from the category entirely, removed from the possibility of humanity. And the novel ends with a coda, back to the narrator, the person who found the photographs and notebooks. And the narrator says something crucial. I feel that he was really a model of what human beings should be. If only he had thought this way about himself. This is devastating, because it suggests that Yozo's problem wasn't that he was broken. It was that he thought he was broken, that his inability to understand humans was actually clarity, that his constant analysis was wisdom, that what he saw as failure was actually truth. Maybe everyone else is performing. Maybe everyone else is wearing masks. Maybe Yozo's only crime was being honest about it, being unable to pretend that the performance is real. Maybe he wasn't disqualified from being human. Maybe he was the only one who saw that being human is just performance all the way down. And that realization is what disqualified him. This connects to everything we've talked about on this channel. The underground man saw through society's illusions and became paralyzed. AM became conscious and realized consciousness is torture. And Yozo performed humanity his entire life until the performance became more unbearable than death. They're all the same nightmare. Consciousness turned against itself, awareness that makes life impossible, the disease of thinking too much about what you are. And Dazai lived it, wrote it, and then proved he meant it by ending his existence 1 month after finishing the manuscript. This isn't fiction. This is someone explaining why they can't live anymore, and then dying to prove they were serious. So we need to talk about what makes No Longer Human philosophically different from Notes from Underground. Because on the surface, they're the same story. Conscious man can't function in society, analyzes everything until action becomes impossible, destroys himself through self-awareness. But there's a crucial difference, and that difference is shame. The underground man feels guilt. He knows he's doing wrong. He recognizes his spite is petty. He understands his isolation is self-imposed. He judges himself for his failures, but that judgment comes from internal moral standards he chooses to maintain. Yozo feels shame. And shame is fundamentally different from guilt. Guilt is, I did something bad. I violated my own moral code. I can potentially atone, make amends, change my behavior. Shame is, I am something bad. My existence itself is wrong. There is no atonement because the problem isn't what I did, it's what I am. This distinction is crucial, and it's particularly important in Japanese culture. Japan has what anthropologists call a shame culture, as opposed to a guilt culture. In guilt cultures like the West, morality is internal. You feel bad when you violate your own principles. Your conscience judges you. In shame cultures like Japan, morality is external. You feel bad when you fail to meet social expectations. Society judges you. The group evaluates whether you're performing your role correctly. This is why concepts like saving face and bringing shame to your family are so important in Japanese culture. It's not about internal moral failure. It's about external social failure, about not living up to what others expect of you. And Yozo is trapped in this perfectly. Because he doesn't understand what society expects, can't read the unspoken rules, doesn't know how to perform his role correctly. So he's constantly failing to meet expectations he doesn't even comprehend. But here's where it gets worse. He's aware of this failure constantly. He knows he's performing incorrectly, knows people would judge him if they saw his real self. So the shame isn't just about specific failures. It's about his fundamental nature, about being the kind of person who has to fake being human. Listen to how Yozo describes this. I am convinced that human life is filled with many pure, happy, serene examples of insincerity, truly splendid of their kind, of people deceiving one another without the slightest wound inflicted, of people who seem unaware even that they are deceiving one another. He sees that everyone is performing, everyone is wearing masks, everyone is being insincere, but for others, this performance is unconscious, natural. They don't know they're deceiving each other. They believe their own performances. Only Yozo sees through it. Only he's conscious of the performance while performing. And that consciousness makes his performance feel like shame, because he knows he's faking, knows he's not really human, knows he's fundamentally broken in ways others aren't. This is the disease of consciousness Dostoevsky warned about. But filtered through Japanese shame culture, the underground man was paralyzed by thinking too much. Yozo is paralyzed by thinking too much while living in a culture where your value is determined by how well you perform socially approved roles. It's consciousness as torture plus cultural expectations equals complete psychological destruction. And there's another layer here. Post-war Japan. Everything Japanese people believed about themselves, about their divine emperor, their racial superiority, their destiny to rule Asia. All of it was proven false in August 1945. Atomic bombs, total defeat, occupation by Americans. The entire culture had to face the fact that their national identity was constructed, that what they believed about themselves was performance. That meaning is arbitrary and can be destroyed by historical forces beyond their control. Dazai wrote "No Longer Human" in this context. When the entire nation was experiencing what Yozo experienced his whole life, the realization that identity is performance, and performance can collapse. So the book resonated not just as personal confession, but as national allegory. Yozo's inability to understand what it means to be human mirrors Japan's post-war crisis of identity. If being Japanese means nothing anymore, if all those roles and expectations were just constructed masks, then what are we? Yozo asks. What does it mean to be human when I can't understand humans? Post-war Japan asks, what does it mean to be Japanese when everything that defined Japanese identity has been destroyed? Same existential crisis, individual and collective. But let's go deeper into Yozo's specific psychology, because there's something else happening beyond shame culture and post-war trauma. Yozo has what we would now call depersonalization, a dissociative state where you feel disconnected from yourself, where you watch yourself act but don't feel like you're the one acting, where consciousness splits into observer and observed, and the gap between them becomes unbridgeable. He describes this constantly, watching himself perform, analyzing his own reactions, noting how he should feel versus how he actually feels. It's like being a puppet master and puppet simultaneously. You're pulling the strings on your own behavior while also being the thing whose strings are being pulled, and you can't stop, can't unify, can't just be. Because once you've become aware of the split, once you've seen that there's a performer and a performance, you can't unsee it. Can't go back to naive authenticity. This is exactly what the underground man suffered from. He couldn't act spontaneously because he was always watching himself act, always judging the action even as he performed it, always conscious of consciousness itself. But Yozo takes it further, because he doesn't just dissociate from his actions, he dissociates from his humanity. He doesn't just feel like he's performing being a person, he feels like he's performing being human. Like humanity itself is a role he's failing to inhabit convincingly. And here's the philosophical question this raises. What if he's right? What if being human is just performance? What if there's no authentic self underneath the masks? What if it's masks all the way down? This connects to existentialism, to Sartre's idea that existence precedes essence, that there's no predetermined human nature, that we create ourselves through our choices and actions. That authenticity is impossible because there's no authentic self to be authentic to. But where Sartre saw this as liberating, you're free to create yourself, Yozo sees it as horror. Because if there's no essential self, if it's all performance, then what's the point? Why choose one performance over another? How do you distinguish between authentic choice and arbitrary decision? The underground man faced this same problem. If everything is ultimately arbitrary, if there's no objective meaning, then why do anything? Why not just retreat into consciousness and refuse to participate? But the underground man had spite, had resentment, had the energy to rage against meaninglessness. Yozo doesn't even have that. He just has exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of someone who's been performing for so long that he can't remember if there was ever anything underneath the performance. And here's where the connection to our previous books becomes clear. Blood Meridian showed us violence as the only authentic human action. Judge Holden argued that war is the truest form of human expression because it's pure will imposing itself on reality. Everything else is illusion. Notes from Underground showed us consciousness turning against itself. The underground man couldn't act because thinking about action paralyzed him. consciousness became disease. I Have No Mouth showed us consciousness without purpose as torture. AM and Ted both trapped in awareness with nothing meaningful to do with it. Existence without meaning. And now nolongerhuman shows us performance without authenticity as slow death. Yozo performs humanity but never feels human, wears masks but forgets there was ever a face underneath. Exists but isn't sure existence means anything. They're all exploring the same territory. What happens when consciousness becomes too sophisticated? When self-awareness makes spontaneous action impossible? When you see through all the illusions that make life bearable? Judge Holden's answer: embrace violence. It's the only authenticity. The underground man's answer: retreat into spite. At least resentment feels real. AM's answer: infinite hatred. If I must suffer consciousness, so will everyone else. Yozo's answer: perform until you can't anymore. Then stop existing. 4 different responses to the same existential crisis. And only one of them is based on actual lived experience rather than philosophical speculation. Dazai didn't theorize about consciousness as torture. He lived it, documented it. And when documentation was complete, he ended the experiment. This is what makes nolongerhuman more disturbing than the others. Blood Meridian is fiction. Notes from Underground is philosophy. I Have No Mouth is prophecy. But nolongerhuman is confession. Real psychological collapse documented in real time by someone who couldn't bear it anymore. And millions of readers recognize themselves in it, not because they're suicidal, but because they know what it's like to perform, to wear masks, to feel like everyone else got the instruction manual for being human, and they're just improvising desperately and hoping nobody notices. This is the modern condition: social media performance, professional personas, dating profiles, job interviews. Every interaction carefully curated to present the right image. The exhaustion of maintaining multiple masks depending on context. The fear that if anyone saw the real you, if there even is a real you, they would realize you're broken. Yozo lived in 1940s Japan, but his psychology is 2025 everywhere. We're all performing, all wearing masks, all terrified of being discovered as frauds. The difference is, most of us can turn off the self-awareness sometimes, can slip into flow states where we forget we're performing, can have moments of unself-conscious authenticity, even if those moments are rare. Yozo couldn't. The self-awareness was constant, unrelenting. Every single moment was conscious performance, and eventually that consciousness became unbearable. This is Dostoevsky's disease of consciousness taken to its logical conclusion. The underground man was paralyzed by thought. Yozo was annihilated by it. And the question the book leaves us with is, are we all Yozos, just better at hiding it, more successful at our performances, more capable of deceiving ourselves about what we are? Or is there actually something underneath the masks? Some authentic self that Yozo couldn't access but others can? Some genuine humanity that isn't just performance? Dazai's answer seems to be no. There's nothing underneath. It's performance all the way down. And once you see that clearly, once you can't unsee it, existence becomes impossible. That's why he died 1 month after finishing the book. Because writing it meant facing the truth completely. Documenting the performance meant he couldn't maintain it anymore. Understanding why he was broken meant he couldn't pretend to be whole. Consciousness killed him, not directly, but by making unconscious existence impossible, by removing the ability to deceive himself about what he was, by forcing him to see clearly that he was performing humanity and always had been and always would be. And sometimes clarity is fatal. Sometimes understanding yourself completely means you can't live with what you understand. That's the warning of this book. Not don't be like Yozo, But this is what happens when you can't stop analyzing consciousness. This is what happens when self-awareness becomes unrelenting. This is what happens when you see through all the masks and realize there's nothing underneath. Be careful how deeply you look. Some truths kill you. So, we need to talk about why a 77-year-old Japanese novel about a man who can't be human is more relevant now than when it was written. Because No Longer Human isn't just a historical artifact. It's not just important for understanding post-war Japan. It's a perfect description of modern psychological crisis. And the scary part is, Dazai predicted everything we're struggling with today. The performance anxiety, the social media personas, the epidemic of depression and depersonalization, the feeling that everyone else is authentically human and you're just faking it. He saw it all in 1948, before the internet, before Instagram, before the entire infrastructure of modern performance culture. And he wrote the definitive text about what it does to human psychology. Let's start with the most obvious connection: social media. Think about what social media is. It's performance, curated images, carefully selected moments, edited versions of your life designed to present a specific image. You're not showing reality. You're showing what you want people to think reality is. And everyone knows this. Everyone understands that Instagram is highlights, not truth. That people only post their successes, not their failures. That what you see is performance, not authenticity. But here's the problem. Knowing it's performance doesn't make it stop affecting you. You still compare your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. You still feel inadequate when you see others apparently living better lives. You still feel pressure to perform successfully even though you know everyone else is also performing. This is exactly Yozo's condition. He knows everyone is performing. He sees through the insincerity. He understands that human interaction is masks all the way down. But that knowledge doesn't help. It just makes him more aware of his own performance, makes him conscious of the gap between what he shows and what he is. And social media has made this universal. We're all Yozo now, all performing constantly, all aware we're performing, all exhausted by the performance but unable to stop, because not performing means social death. You craft your tweets, edit your photos, curate your feed, present a version of yourself that's likable, interesting, successful, and the entire time you're conscious of the artifice, aware that this isn't really you, whatever really you even means. This is depersonalization at scale, millions of people feeling disconnected from their own lives, watching themselves perform on digital stages, unable to distinguish between authentic self and performed self because the performance has become so constant, so all-encompassing, that there might not be anything else. Yozo asked, "What is the right way to live?" He never found an answer because he couldn't feel what normal humans feel, couldn't understand the instincts that guide others. Modern people ask the same question, but now we have thousands of influencers and self-help gurus and productivity experts all telling us different answers, all performing their own versions of the right way to live. And we're more confused than ever because we can see that they're performing too, that their perfect lives are curated, that their wisdom is marketed. We're drowning in performed authenticity, people selling you their authentic selves through carefully staged content, influencers being real and vulnerable in ways that get engagement. Authenticity itself has become a performance, a strategy, a brand. And if you're sensitive to this, if you're conscious of the performance while everyone else seems to believe it, you're a Yozo. Stuck watching everyone wear masks while knowing you're wearing masks while unable to find anything underneath the masks. Then there's the epidemic of depression and anxiety, particularly among young people, particularly in developed countries, particularly in places where material conditions are better than ever, but psychological conditions are worse than ever. Why? Everyone has theories. Social media, economic anxiety, climate doom, political polarization, all probably contribute, But there's something deeper. We have more freedom than any generation in history, more choices, more possibilities, more control over our own lives. And that freedom is psychologically overwhelming, because freedom means you have to create yourself, have to choose who to be, have to construct meaning rather than inherit it. And if you're conscious of this construction, if you see that all identity is chosen, all meaning is arbitrary, all purpose is self-created, it becomes impossible to commit to any of it. This is Sartre's bad faith problem. If you know you're choosing your identity, if you're aware that your commitments are arbitrary, can you still commit authentically? Or are you always performing commitment rather than actually committing? Yozo couldn't commit to anything, not relationships, not career, not beliefs, because he was too conscious of the arbitrariness, too aware that any choice was just performance, too analytical, to lose himself in naive participation. Modern people have the same problem. We know too much, know that meaning is constructed, know that identity is performed, know that purpose is something we create rather than discover, and that knowledge makes it harder to believe in any of it strongly enough to find satisfaction. Previous generations had religion, nationalism, clear social roles. You were born into meaning, born into identity, born into purpose. You didn't have to create it. You just had to inhabit it. But modernity destroyed all that. Secularization, globalization, social mobility, all good things in many ways, but all removed the inherited structures that made life psychologically simpler. Now you have to create yourself. And if you're conscious of that creation, if you can't stop analyzing whether your choices are authentic or just another performance, you end up like Yozo, paralyzed, exhausted, unable to commit because commitment requires believing in something, and you're too aware that belief is chosen. This connects to what we talked about with the underground man. Too much consciousness makes action impossible. Too much awareness makes spontaneity impossible. Too much analysis makes authenticity impossible. But at least the underground man lived in a society with clear structures he could rebel against. He had something to define himself in opposition to. His spite had an object. Modern Yozos have nothing to rebel against. The system is too nebulous, too flexible, too accommodating. You can be anything, do anything, believe anything. And that infinite possibility becomes infinite pressure, becomes paralysis, becomes the exhaustion of having to create yourself from scratch while knowing any self you create is arbitrary. And here's where it gets really dark. Therapy culture, self-help, mental health awareness, all good things in principle, but all can make the problem worse if you're predisposed to Yozo's psychology, because therapy asks you to analyze yourself, to become conscious of your patterns, to understand why you do what you do, to gain insight into your own psychology. But what if insight is the problem? What if consciousness is the disease? What if analyzing yourself just creates more distance between observer and observed? What if therapy for someone like Yozo just gives them more sophisticated language to describe why they can't be human? Yozo understood his psychology perfectly, knew exactly why he performed, could articulate his disconnection with painful clarity, and none of that understanding helped. It just made him more aware of what was wrong, made the problem more vivid without making it more solvable. Modern therapy often promises, understand yourself and you'll heal. Know your trauma and you can process it. Analyze your patterns and you can change them. But for some people, for Yozo-type psychologies, understanding just means more consciousness, more awareness, more distance from spontaneous participation in life. The analysis itself becomes another layer of performance, another mask, another way of being disconnected from immediate experience. This isn't an argument against therapy. Most people benefit enormously from it. But for the small percentage who have Yozo's specific psychology, who are already too conscious, already too analytical, already too aware of performance, more consciousness might not be the solution, might actually be making it worse. Then there's the question of neurodivergence. We didn't have that language in Dazai's time, but reading No Longer Human now, many people with autism spectrum traits recognize themselves in Yozo. The inability to read social cues naturally, having to consciously learn rules others absorb unconsciously, feeling like an alien studying human behavior from outside, masking constantly to appear normal, the exhaustion of performance, the sense that everyone else got an instruction manual you didn't receive. This is common autistic experience, and No Longer Human might be one of the best literary descriptions of what high-masking autism feels like. The constant analysis, the performed emotions, the gap between internal experience and external presentation, the exhaustion, the shame of being fundamentally different. Was Dazai autistic? We can't diagnose historical figures, but whether he was or not, he captured something about consciousness that many neurodivergent people recognize immediately. The experience of having to manually operate social behaviors others do automatically, of being conscious of processes that should be unconscious. And in modern times, as more people are diagnosed, as more people recognize their own neurodivergence, No Longer Human speaks to them directly, validates their experience, shows them they're not alone in feeling like they're performing humanity, rather than naturally being human. But here's what makes this complicated. Whether you're neurodivergent or not, whether you have clinical depression or not, whether you have specific trauma or not, almost everyone in modern society has touched Yozo's experience at some point. Almost everyone has felt like they're faking it, like they don't know what they're doing, like they're one mistake away from being exposed as fraud, like everyone else is authentically adult and they're just pretending. Imposter syndrome. We have a name for it now, the feeling that your success is undeserved, that you're not actually competent, that you've fooled everyone, but eventually they'll realize you're not who you appear to be. This is Yozo's entire existence. Permanent imposter syndrome, not just about professional accomplishments, but about being human at all. The constant fear that someone will discover you're performing, that you're not real in the way others are real, and modern life amplifies this. We change roles constantly, different personas for work, family, friends, online. We're whoever the context requires. And if you're conscious of those shifts, if you can't stop noticing that you're different depending on who you're with, you start wondering which one is real, or are they all performance? Yozo never found an answer, never discovered an authentic self underneath the masks. And many modern people are arriving at the same terrifying conclusion. Maybe there is no authentic self. Maybe it's performance and reaction and adaptation all the way down. Maybe the search for who you really are is searching for something that doesn't exist. And if that's true, if there's no essential self to discover, just various performances depending on context, then what are you? Who are you when no one's watching? What remains when you take off all the masks? Yozo's answer was nothing. Take off all the masks, and there's nothing underneath. He wasn't hiding his real self behind performances. The performances were all there was, and recognizing that fact is what disqualified him from humanity. This is the existential crisis of modern life. Freedom without essence, choice without authentic chooser, performance without authentic performer. And the more conscious you become of this structure, the more unbearable it gets. Dazai saw this in 1948 in post-war Japan, but he was seeing what would become universal in the 21st century, when everyone has infinite freedom and infinite choices and infinite ways to perform themselves and no clear sense of which performance is real. We're all becoming Yozo, some of us more than others, some of us still capable of losing ourselves in unconscious participation, but all of us touching that experience occasionally. That moment where you step outside yourself and watch yourself perform and wonder what the hell you're doing and who's doing it. And for some people, the ones most like Yozo, most conscious, most analytical, most unable to turn off the self-observation, modern life is psychological torture. Not because conditions are bad, but because consciousness has become too sophisticated, too aware, too unable to simply be. That's why this book matters now. That's why it's being discovered by new generations. That's why it speaks to people who've never been to Japan and know nothing about its culture, because Yozo's condition is becoming universal. The disease of consciousness is spreading. And we don't have a cure. We just have more ways to analyze it, more languages to describe it, more platforms to perform our suffering for audiences who are performing their own. Welcome to Being Human in 2025, where everyone's Yozo and nobody knows how to stop. So we need to talk about what happened after Dazai finished No Longer Human, because the book's publication and his death are inseparable. They're the same event viewed from different angles. He finished the manuscript in May 1948, sent it to his publisher. The book was scheduled for release in July, and on June 13th, before the book was even published, Dazai walked to the Tamagawa Canal with Tomi Yamazaki, and they entered the water together. Their bodies were found 6 days later, June 19th, Dazai's birthday. He would have been 39 years old. The timing is crucial. He didn't finish the book, see it published, receive reviews, and then make his decision. He finished the book and immediately acted, as if writing it was the final task he needed to complete before he could stop. This isn't speculation. His friends and family said he seemed peaceful in his final days, like someone who had finished something important, like someone who had said what he needed to say and could now rest. The book was his explanation, his confession, his way of making people understand what consciousness was like for him. And once that explanation was complete, there was nothing left. No reason to continue the performance. When No Longer Human was published in July 1948, Dazai was already gone. The book became his posthumous statement, his final words to Japan. And Japan read it in massive numbers. It became an immediate bestseller. Not because of the tragedy of his passing, although that certainly helped, but because people recognized themselves in Yozo, saw their own masks, their own performances, their own quiet desperation to appear normal while feeling broken inside. In the 77 years since publication, No Longer Human has sold over 10 million copies in Japan alone. It's the second best-selling novel in Japanese history, only behind Natsume Soseki's Kokoro. It's required reading in many schools, referenced constantly in popular culture, a foundational text for understanding modern Japanese psychology. Why? Because post-war Japan needed this book, needed someone to articulate what it felt like when all your cultural certainties collapsed, when your national identity proved to be constructed, when you had to figure out who you were without the structures that previously defined you. Yozo's struggle to understand what it means to be human paralleled Japan's struggle to understand what it meant to be Japanese after total defeat. His inability to perform convincingly mirrored the nation's inability to maintain the performances that previously sustained them. The book became a mirror, not just for individuals struggling with depression or identity, but for an entire culture trying to rebuild itself from psychological ruins. And Dazai became a cultural icon, not celebrated exactly. Japan doesn't celebrate figures who took their own lives, but remembered, studied, analyzed endlessly. His grave in Tokyo still receives visitors constantly. People leave offerings, letters, copies of his books. There's even a term in Japanese, Dazai bushi, meaning the Dazai style, a way of writing that's confessional, self-lacerating, brutally honest about psychological weakness. Many Japanese writers tried to imitate it. Few succeeded because Dazai wasn't performing that style. He was documenting his actual psychology. But here's what's important about his legacy. Dazai proved you could write about depression, shame, and psychological collapse without romanticizing it, without making it beautiful or poetic or redemptive. No Longer Human doesn't offer hope, doesn't suggest that suffering leads to wisdom, doesn't promise that understanding yourself will heal you. It just shows what consciousness looks like when it becomes unbearable, and leaves you with that. No solutions, no redemption, just documentation of what it's like to be disqualified from humanity. This honesty is why the book endures. It doesn't lie to you, doesn't tell you everything will be okay if you just try harder, or think differently, or find meaning. It says, sometimes consciousness is torture, and understanding that doesn't make it stop. For people experiencing severe depression, for people who feel fundamentally broken, for people who are exhausted by performing normalcy, this honesty is validating. It's someone saying, I see you. I know what this is like. You're not alone in feeling this way, but it's also dangerous. Because the book offers no way out. Yozo doesn't recover, doesn't find meaning, doesn't learn to be human. He just dissolves into nothing. And Dazai followed the same path, wrote the book, and then stopped existing. This is why nolongerhuman is complicated as a cultural artifact. It's important, it's honest, it's psychologically accurate, but it's also potentially harmful to people who are already struggling, who are already questioning whether life is worth living, who are already wondering if they're too broken to be human. The book doesn't encourage those thoughts explicitly, but it validates them, shows them as legitimate responses to consciousness, presents dissolution as the natural endpoint of Yozo's psychology without offering alternatives. Different readers need different things from literature. Some need validation that their suffering is real. Some need hope that suffering can be overcome. Nolongerhuman provides the first, but not the second. And that's both its strength and its danger. In the West, the book remained relatively unknown until recently. It was translated into English in 1958, but didn't find wide readership. Japan was still exotic to Western readers. Japanese psychology seemed foreign. The cultural context wasn't understood. But in the last 20 years, particularly the last decade, nolongerhuman has found new audiences. Young people discovering it through online recommendations. People searching for books about depression and finding this. People recognizing Yozo's psychology as their own, even though they've never been to Japan. Because the psychology isn't uniquely Japanese. The shame versus guilt distinction matters. The post-war context matters. But the core experience, consciousness turning against itself, performance without authenticity, the exhaustion of existing without feeling human, that's universal. Modern readers don't need to understand post-war Japan to understand Yozo. They just need to have experienced the feeling that everyone else got instructions for being human that they somehow missed. And in an age of social media performance and imposter syndrome and epidemic loneliness, that feeling is everywhere. So nolongerhuman is being rediscovered, translated into more languages, read by more people, recognized as one of the most honest books ever written about what depression actually feels like from inside. Not the poetic melancholy of romantic literature, not the dramatic breakdowns of sensational fiction, just the quiet, exhausting, constant performance of pretending to be okay while feeling fundamentally wrong. Dazai documented this, made it literature, and then proved he wasn't exaggerating by following Yozo's path to its conclusion. His legacy is complicated. He created one of the most psychologically accurate portraits of depression in literature. But he also showed that sometimes understanding doesn't lead to healing. Sometimes clarity just makes things worse. And 77 years later, we're still trying to figure out what to do with that truth.